Loving God of so many names, thank you for bringing us together once again this morning on this Resurrection Sunday, a day when much was revealed at the tomb, but much more that is revealed in our own lives. Be with each of us as we share the true spirit of Christ with each other and with those around us. Let us be that gift to one another through the reveal that you give. Open our hearts this morning, but even more, open our minds, and let us be the receptors of the words that are about to be spoken. So I ask now that you touch my lips of clay and mold them into the words that need to be spoken this morning, and that the words that come from my mouth and the meditations that come from each and every one of their hearts, may they be ever acceptable to you. As we say, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Alleluia. Amen. So I have to say, what a glorious week it was this past week, at least from last Sunday when we shouted our hosannas on Palm Sunday through this entire last week of Holy Week. Wednesday we hosted our ecumenical sisters and brothers from Underwood Memorial Baptist Church and from Calvary Memorial United Church of Christ as we all came together for a Holy Wednesday ecumenical communion service and potluck. There was more food to feed an army than you can believe, and there's leftovers, there's cake and all that. So after church, have some coffee and some cake and enjoy all of that. But it was great having them together. And on Thursday evening, we journeyed out to Tosa, where we had our foot washing and communion service with our sisters and brothers at Underwood Baptist. And then on Friday evening, the moving and heart-warming story of Jesus' death at the tomb through the Tenebrae service out at Calvary Memorial United Church of Christ. This is truly the Christian season for many of us in our Christian faith during this week. And over this past week, as we rode through Jerusalem and shouting those hosannas and all that, we also learned a lot. We saw where Jesus was showing his disciples that they needed to be the followers of Christ and to serve one another and to love one another, and just as we love ourselves. This past week, we also sat with the woman at the foot of the cross on Friday as we wept through the crucified Christ. And then from Friday to this morning, we waited in emptiness of the tomb, hoping that God would reveal something anew for us. And this morning we celebrate that Christ is risen, and even more that life is eternal and everything has changes. We heard in this morning's gospel from John, as it was filled with emotions of life that we face on our daily basis. We learned that there were women who arrived at the tomb on the morning after the Sabbath was complete. Ironically, in John's gospel, it is Mary Magdalene who arrives first. And finding that stone had been rolled away from the tomb as she ran to tell Peter and the other disciple. And as she did that, they ran to the tomb, each going to find nothing but Jesus' burial linens lying there. They returned to their homes, leaving Mary there standing alone, weeping. And as she wept, she bent over once again to look into the tomb, and as we heard, saw two angels and asked why she was weeping. And as we heard in Scripture, she replied, "Because you have taken my Lord, and I don't know where you have taken him." And then the entire picture changes, like the scenery from a Broadway production that goes from bleak to wow. Here is Mary looking around to see where they had placed Jesus. And she sees someone who she thinks is the gardener, and we hear Christ say to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" Now, Mary really didn't have the time of day to deal with that gardener, and sharply replied back to him, saying, "If you have carried him away, please tell me where you've taken him, so I can care for him." And it was at that moment, on that day, that Mary probably felt like a fool, like maybe the rest of us would. as we hear Christ addressed her by her first name saying, Mary, at which point she recognizes and blurts out, Rabboni, or teacher, or my Lord. And Mary recognizes Christ. But what is so unique about that day is that Christ gives her instructions to go tell the disciples that he would soon be ascending to God. Or as he puts it, his Father. So Mary goes and finds the rest and announces that she has seen Christ. So at least in John's Gospel, it was Mary who was the very first witness of this resurrection. And by her announcement to the disciples, she became an apostle of herself to the apostles. So let me tell you, as she was learning this, she didn't sit around trying to figure all this out, or just figured out what was happened. And in good old Mary Magdalene style, she went right on to do the work that she was supposed to do. Her response to this resurrection was, go into action mode. Go reveal to the rest of the people what had just happened and get to work. She was a no-nonsense kind of gal. So back at the disciples' watering hole, Peter and the other disciple, who we presume is John, had been to the tomb and left before Christ had even appeared. They were much more interested in who made it to the tomb first that morning rather than who was the first to appear inside the tomb. And then our friend Mary, on the other hand, wasn't the type. She was just interested in she wasn't interested in that competition stuff. She didn't care who was first or who was last and all that. She was much more interested in getting that work done and doing what Christ had said. Christ had told her to do what the risen Christ had asked her to do, was to reveal. She was working it. She went and told the others that she had seen him. Yes, him. It's kind of like you say, work it, girl. But she was working it that day. She was telling everybody that Christ had risen. Christ had come out of the tomb. It was her example that actually inspires a lot of the early church to spend a whole lot less debating on how or why there was a resurrection, but instead to go ahead and put the resurrection into practice. It took having a resurrected Christ to show up for Peter and the rest of the disciples numerous times from that first announcement. But eventually, as confused as it seems to be, they finally got that light bulb to turn on in their head and also put it into practice. So you could say that they learned what is called practice resurrection. And I'm sure you're thinking, what the heck is he talking about? Well, I'm going to tell you. There's an author, Nora Gallagher, who talks about this idea of what practice resurrection is. Gallagher, who is a minister, says, when I think about resurrection now, I not only wonder what happened to Jesus, I ponder what happened to his disciples. Something happened to them too that day. They went into hiding after the crucifixion, but after the resurrection appearances, they walked back out into the world. They became braver and stronger. They visited strangers and healed the sick. It was not just that they had saw. It was not just what they had saw when Jesus was alive or how they saw it, but it was in them and it had set them free. What if the resurrection is not about the appearances of Jesus alone, but about but also about what those appearances point to and what they ask? It's finally what we do with them and matters that maybe resurrection, like everything else, needs to be practiced. So practicing resurrection, it has moved beyond the crippling grief over death of a loved one to envision and live new opportunities in our lives following maybe a loss of a job or something. To live through deliberating depression and to find reasons for hope. To overcome our fears of life and the spirit and to adventure the possibilities. to live hopefully in spite and in face of depression, of injustice, that is what practicing resurrection is. Another great example of revealing or practicing resurrection is found in this book that Jim Wallis wrote called God's Politics. Now, it's not what you think. It's not a political book, but it's God's Politics. Wallis tells this powerful story about practicing resurrection. It's set in South Africa under the apartheid, and it was in the time when Nelson Mandela was still in prison and seemed to have a strange hold on power. Wallis writes from being at an ecumenical service at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. And at this ecumenical service, the then Archbishop Desmond Tutu was presiding, when a group of notorious South African security police broke into the service. Wallis writes this in his book. Tutu stopped preaching and just looked at the intruders as they lined the wall of the cathedral. Wielding writing pads and tape recorders, they had already arrested Tutu and other church leaders just a few weeks before and kept them in jail for several days. After meeting their eyes with a gaze of a steely gaze, Tutu acknowledged their power. Tutu reminded them that he served a higher power than their political authority. Wallis continues to write and say, Archbishop Tutu spoke to these representatives and said, "Since you have already lost, I invite you to come and join the winning side." He said it with a smirky smile and an enticing warmth with his invitation, and did it with such clarity and boldness that it took everybody's breath away. Bishop Tutu declared that apartheid had already lost was a prophetic announcement for that time, or that reveal of something that has no basis whatsoever. He was already, in spite of evidence, living into and inviting others to imagine a hope for the future. He was practicing resurrection. So back to our good old gal Mary back at the tomb and what was going on there. But her and many of the other women that we hear in these Gospels, none of them played it safe. Not by any means. They were the type of women who jumped out there and did something. They kicked it into gear, so to speak. They lived as it was something true in their lives. They began living, practicing, and doing that reality of resurrection, even back then. After hearing Scripture this morning, I think some of us might get that feeling that Mary was never the same after Easter, and I don't think she was, personally. I don't think anybody was, that matters. But knowing that we as individuals are confident and that we're not held by Jesus, but we're confident that Jesus holds us each and every day. Right? So shortly we're going to gather around the table this morning. Many of our praises and all that will be sung and spoken. But as we gather around the table this morning, let it be the praises for the risen Christ being unending. May we be filled with that joy of Mary when she sets her eyes on the teacher, sets her eyes on Jesus for the first time from that resurrecting tomb. That we reveal our own resurrections this morning and how God has changed our lives. And that we are changed. That, like Mary, we want to run from this place and tell the whole world a story. We want to run and say that we are people of God and that we are in this place and we are forever changed. So as we come to the table this day, let it be that revealed Christ or that revealed resurrection in us that becomes the gifts that we share with others. So let's celebrate. Let it be this day. Christ is risen, and Christ has risen indeed. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.